At 7:42 on April 5, 1944, in the damp pre-dawn hangar at Peleliu Airstrip, Sergeant Jack Miller, 29 years old and head flight mechanic for the 43rd Fighter Squadron, crouched beneath the right wing of an F-6F Hellcat and traced a fingertip along a cable housing as if reading a braille for machines. The air smelled of hot oil, seawater, and old canvas. The fluorescent bulbs hummed, a distant radio bled static, and a crow cawed from a charred coconut tree. Jack had grown up on a farm outside Dayton, Ohio, learning to fix his father's tractor by the feel of a bearing and the sound a pulley made when it was about to fail. To anyone filling a maintenance log, the issue sounded trivial: a quarter-inch of play in the aileron cable run, a subtle slack that only showed under lateral stress. In the sky, that slack meant a delayed roll, a turn radius that put a pilot half a second behind a nimble Mitsubishi Zero, and half a second in aerial combat was often the distance between parachute cords opening and a fuselage disintegrating. 3 sorties in the last month had returned with the same grim patterns: torn paint on wingtips, twisted landing gear, and pilots whose voices in the debriefing cracked like old wire as they described controls that did not respond when they needed them most. Jack did not believe the factory tolerance sheets. He believed the sound a cable made when plucked, a flat, lazy twang that lasted too long. The solution he would later be known for began that morning as a quiet irritation, a smell of burnt insulation, and a decision he knew would violate regulation if discovered. Losses had piled in ways the squadron could measure and in ways it could not. On March 10, Lieutenant Alan Price came back with a Hellcat that would not complete a roll fast enough to evade a snapshot of machine gun fire. In the debriefing, Alan leaned on the edge of a table, his flight suit stained with sweat and grease, and said, "It felt like pushing through molasses. I moved the stick and the plane took its time to answer." Corporal Eddie Morales, who had been the wing technician on that mission, stood with arms crossed and soft hands, smelling of coffee and hydraulic fluid, and replied, "We checked the cable tension on the checklist. It was within spec." Captain Robert Sterling shot a look at the maintenance logs and said, "Specs do not matter if men do not live to follow them." The room had the tang of cigarette tobacco and the metallic bite of solder when Tom Bennett, a pilot who had seen a wingman go down, added, "We lost Manny on the 13th. Same story. Plane lagged and he paid the price." Those sentences were short and blunt, but they carried the weight of a ledger and the smell of wet earth from a funeral. In another incident, on March 22nd, pilot Samuel Ito stepped into the hangar with his cap in hand, cheeks hollow from lack of sleep. He said, "My plane refused to bank on the last pass. It was like the controls were on someone else's time." Susan Hale, a civilian engineer attached to the depot, pushed a strand of hair behind her ear and murmured, "If there is play in the routing, it can double the effective response time." Across these reports, a pattern emerged that diagrams and reports could not capture: a sound, a feel, a hesitation that became a casualty number. The squadron began to whisper about tolerances and craft, about whether design or maintenance panels had written the fate of pilots. Those whispers turned into arguments at mess hall tables where plates clicked, where coffee steamed, where men debated the line between training and equipment. Somewhere between the logs and the lunches, Jack's irritation hardened into resolve. He asked himself what one man could change when the manual and the factory said change was unnecessary. That question led to a night and a wire and an act that was, officially, not authorized. If the investigation that followed demanded diagrams and physics, the discovery itself was tactile and patient. The Hellcat aileron system used a run of cable through a sequence of pulleys and guides. Any deflection at one guide, multiplied by torque at the stick, could translate into degrees of deflection at the aileron surface. Technically speaking, the issue was not a failed cable, but a compound of routing friction, a slightly worn guide that let the cable bow under load, and a tiny allowance in the attachment clevis that let the cable retract a hair further than it should. Jack had spent 6 months at the depot learning the exact way these systems breathed. He knew the names of pulleys and the feeling of a bearing that had been starved of grease. He had a backstory that explained his stubbornness, written in grease and discipline.
As a boy, he had watched his mother tighten the spokes on a wagon wheel so the milk could reach the market without spilling. At 16, he apprenticed to an aircraft mechanic in Dayton, reading maintenance manuals as if they were hymns, but trusting his fingers more than any paragraph. He had joined the Navy because he wanted machines to obey him, to feel in his hands the small adjustments that kept men alive. In training, he had been the one who stayed after hours, feeling for the irregularities that others missed. When he arrived in the Pacific, he carried with him the patience to examine a cable twice, the habit of noticing a twang, and the unwillingness to accept bureaucratic complacency. The regulations forbade field modifications without authorization from the manufacturer or a depot. The inspectors were strict about maintaining a paper trail. Yet the paper trail had no answer for a 3/8 of an inch play that turned into a lethal lag.
In a rollin' dogfight. Jack wrote that backstory in his head often as he worked, reminding himself that practical knowledge came from touch and trial, that sometimes saving a pilot meant bending rules and trusting a hand taught by tractors and small-town garages. The night he acted was humid and bright with moonlight that leaked through the corrugated roof. Jack worked with a handful of tools on a battered workbench that carried the ghosts of 1,000 repairs. The air held the smell of solder and salt, the clink of metal on metal, the low guffaw of men telling a joke too often repeated. The scene required both stealth and speed. He conferred in low voices with Eddie Morales and Tom Bennett. The dialogue was terse and measured. Jack said, "We do it now or we keep losing men." Eddie replied, "If we get caught, it is court-martial and a lot worse." Tom answered, "We cannot wait for paperwork to catch up with bullets." Susan, who had stayed late, whispered, "What exactly are you planning to do?" Jack ran a gloved finger along the cable path and explained, "A small loop of piano wire routed as a guide will remove the bow at the problem guide. It will change where the load goes when the stick is pulled." There were 6 more exchanges as they argued placement, the risk of chafing, and how to secure the wire so it did not introduce new failure modes. The sensory details of that patch were precise. The cold bite of metal against the palm, the metallic shiver when a wire was plucked, the sharp smell of a file shaven brass, the sting of a small cut under a bandage, and the taste of dust on the tongue from filings. The operation took less than 15 minutes. Jack threaded a slim piece of piano wire through an access plate, bent it into a subtle Z-shape, and anchored it to a non-load-bearing bracket so that the cable now ran with reduced lateral movement at the worn guide. The motion felt right to his hand. His fingers registered a small, clean resistance where previously there had been a soft give. It was illegal, unrecorded, and dangerous to his career if exposed. He knew he had placed himself between a tribunal and a ledger, and he also knew the ledger had lost too many entries already. The true test came 2 mornings later when Lieutenant Robert Sterling led a scramble to intercept a formation of Zeros attempting a dawn raid. Over the radio, the call signs crackled. "Viper flight, scramble now," Robert said. The pilots answered in quick succession. "Viper 1, ready," Tom Bennett replied. "Viper 2, contact," Samuel Ito said. The exchanges kept pace as the squadron climbed. "Jack, how does she feel?" Tom asked over an open channel. Jack answered briefly, "Check aileron right now and report." In the sky, the sensory world was immediate and violent. The smell of fuel and hot oil, the roar of the Pratt & Whitney engines, the vibration of the airframe under gunfire, the metallic ping when bullets found structural skin. As the first engagement unfolded, the difference Jack had engineered manifested in hundreds of seconds that compounded into life-saving seconds. When a Zero dove inside a cloud of tracers, and the Hellcats had to roll hard to escape a firing cone, the Hellcat with Jack's wire trimmed responded with a crispness pilots had not felt in weeks. The radio lit with short exclamations. "Got him," Alan called. "She turns like a knife," Tom said, breathless. Robert's voice over the headset was flat and deliberate. "Form up 2 by 2. Keep tight." The dogfight was a series of rapid commands, maneuvers, and reprioritizations. 6 to 8 exchanges that sounded like music to those who lived by it. The technical result was measurable on return. Flight logs noted that the roll rate improved by a calculated margin, reaction times shortened, and pilot-reported control authority had increased just enough to enable tighter defensive maneuvers. Yet the emotional core of that morning was not in spreadsheets. It was in faces that had been grim and were now animated, in pilots who returned with hands shaking but voices full of relief, and in the way men looked at Jack as if a trick of wire had become a talisman. During the debrief, Captain Sterling leaned on a map table, the day smelling of spent cordite and rain, and said, "Someone in maintenance did something that saved lives today." The line between praise and an investigation was thin, and the squadron felt both gratitude and dread. Once the effect of the wire became known, it spread like an undercurrent through pilots and crews. Informal notes passed from hand to hand, a sketch of the wire route circulated in pencil, and names attached to the act began to multiply in the way legends do. Tom Bennett swore he saw Jack slip a coil into a toolbox and wink. Eddie Morales admitted in the barracks that he had helped secure a bracket. Susan Hale, whose paperwork skills were impeccable, later produced a schematic that masked the modification in innocuous maintenance language. Across the forward area, other mechanics began to try their own variations. The unofficial transmission of the trick created a network of practitioners. Corporal Ray Delgado in the rear echelon copied the idea. Sergeant Frank Owens adapted it for an F-4U, and a young mechanic named Luis Ortega modified it for a courier plane. The informal dissemination was rapid because the incentive was simple and human. Where official channels demanded papers and months of testing, a pilot would not wait. Initial statistics were encouraging. In the next set of sorties, the squadron recorded a drop in control-related incidents, with a measurable reduction in lost aircraft attributed to delayed response in rolls. But official reaction was mixed. An inspector from headquarters, Commander Lewis Crawford, visited with a crisp hat and crisper questions. He said, "Any unapproved modification is a liability and a breach of protocol." Jack answered with a quiet honesty, "We fixed a problem that was killing men." The debate that followed split into two voices. One argued that rule adherence kept aircraft safe across campaigns, the other that living men must trump paperwork. This institutional tension led to an official investigation, cautious commendations, and eventually to the establishment of a field advisory that studied the practice and recommended certified routing changes. The path from clandestine fix to formal adoption was messy, full of memos and testimonies, and it created both allies and critics among engineers, pilots, and commanders. There were moments along the way that carried the weight of choices and the taste of fear. The first moment of tension came the night a supply truck rolled in with an inspector and a crate of spare cable guides. Jack had to decide whether to confess and risk a tribunal or to continue masking the fix. He felt the memory of a funeral with open soil and a folded flag. He remembered his sister's face at a county fair when she had clapped as a prize bull was led into the ring. He weighed the rule book against the smell of fuel and the sound of a plane not answering when it was needed. In 2 short paragraphs, he thought of the boats back home, of tractors that still needed repair, and of a man who might be a brother, if not for a number in a ledger. He chose to stay silent and to copy his notes in a private log, hoping truth would follow results. The second moment of tension happened during a mid-mission radio failure when a pilot could not call for help and had to trust a mechanical change he did not authorize. The radio was a dead, cold thing, and the sun burned at a slant that made clouds look like cliffs. In 3 quick paragraphs, the narrative pulled him into the cockpit memory, where a junior pilot closed his eyes, remembered a mechanic's hands, and pushed the stick with faith. The third moment of tension came when the first official memo arrived questioning unauthorized modifications. Jack lay awake with a bandage on a finger and the taste of metal in his mouth, reading the typed lines that could erase his civilian future. He heard the distant call of waves, the slap of a loose canvas, and felt at once the absurdity of a wire that could change a life and the absurdity of rules that could make heroes into defendants. In those paragraphs, he held both dread and pride and considered what legacy he would accept. The technical explanation of the procedure was, at heart, simple and meticulous. The piano wire acted as a low-friction guide that reduced lateral deflection at a worn pulley and shifted the vector of load through a more stable bracket. This translated into a reduced effective play at the stick by a small angular margin that nevertheless increased roll authority. Jack and Susan recorded it in a neat entry of roughly 300 words that explained the mechanics and noted potential failure points. They recommended additional inspections for chafing and a specified torque for the bracket fastener. The explanation was both practical and accessible and allowed engineers at the depot to translate improvised success into testable parameters. The key lesson for technicians was that a small change in routing geometry could have outsized effects on control response. After deliberation, the higher command issued a cautious endorsement. They authorized a test program and invited Susan Hale and Jack to present their field data. Officially, the maneuver was documented as an engineering change request. Unofficially, the hangars told a different story. Pilots like Tom Bennett and Samuel Ito would later go on record to praise the hands that had kept them alive. Eddie Morales would be given a meritorious service note in his file. Corporal Ray Delgado and Sergeant Frank Owens were mentioned in after-action reports as technicians who improved squadron readiness. Commander Lewis Crawford, who had begun as an inspector suspicious of rule-breaking, wrote a memorandum that acknowledged the practical necessity of field modifications when lives were at stake. The tension between obedience and improvisation eased into a bureaucracy that learned how to listen to the shop floor. 1 month after the modification, the squadron recorded a steady decline in control-related incidents, and pilots held informal gatherings to remember those who had not returned. The tone was quieter and more grateful. Jack received a folded letter from a pilot he had never met, filled with thanks and a cigarette ash ring on the paper. 3 months in the practice was studied and replicated in other units, and an engineering bulletin incorporated some of the routing suggestions, not under Jack's name, but under a generic field advisory. The change saved measurable aircraft and redirected the design conversation in factories back in the States. 6 months later, there were formal training modules that included the inspection points Jack had emphasized. Pilots who once stiffened at the idea of maintenance now attended sessions and asked questions about cable tension and aileron deflection. Jack, who had returned briefly to Dayton on leave, sat in a diner and watched a boy tinker with a radio by feel and recognized in him the same patient curiosity that had set his hand toward solutions. He did not receive an official medal for the act. He did receive invitations to consult on routing improvements and a lifelong series of letters from pilots who had returned home. The moral of the story settled into conversation over time in a phrase that rounded out many debriefs. Small hands and careful judgment sometimes change the course of a campaign more than a directive from above. The legend of a single wire began as necessity, became a field practice, and ended up rebalancing the relationship between manuals and men. If this story weighs on you as it weighed on those who lost friends in the skies, you are not alone. People respond to these narratives because they reveal the faces behind technical reports and the hard choices made in greasy work bays at dawn. Tell us in the comments what small technical detail you think gets overlooked in wartime histories. You can simply write the detail and why you think it mattered, or begin with "I think" and explain a memory or a question. Your comments help this channel find the next story to tell and help others learn how seemingly minor mechanics can shift outcomes. Now we return to the hangar and to the quiet hand of a mechanic who chose an illegal fix over a letter that listed lives as acceptable losses. If this story moved you, please leave a comment and subscribe for more narratives that bridge the human with the technical, the manual with the moral. In the end, Jack's wire trick was less about engineering innovation and more about the courage to trust the senses trained by work and to act when procedures lagged behind danger. The official records would eventually include measured improvements in roll response and a reduced rate of control-related losses. Some engineers would incorporate the routing changes into future designs. The pilots who survived would, in years to come, write letters and remember the feel of a plane that finally obeyed their hands. And for Jack, the legacy was a series of small acknowledgments, a quiet folder in his service record, and a town in Ohio where neighbors asked for his autograph at the county fair because they had heard about the man who fixed a wire and helped bring boys home. Remember that technology rarely exists separate from the people who touch it. If this account stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of those who changed the course of history with tools, patience, and a willingness to break rules for the right reasons.